we're just really thrilled to have you on today. And thank you all so much for the amazing work you do. Would you like to provide an introduction?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a quick 5 to 7 minute crash course in North Korea. Just a real brief history that fits in with your focus on the Constitution. Kathy said that she wanted me to talk a bit about how the history of North Korea and the structure of how their government was set up. So to start off, after World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, which was an arbitrary line where the Allies liberated the southern part of Korea and the Soviets so-called liberated, but not really, the northern part of Korea. In 1947, the United Nations established a temporary commission on Korea, which was to oversee a free and fair election. And the election was held on May 10th, 1948. But the Soviets would not allow any of the Koreans in North Korea to participate in that election. But that was the point on August 15th, 1948, that the Republic of Korea was established with a president who was elected by the people, President Syngman Rhee, and then the UN recognized the Republic of Korea as the only legitimate government on the Korean Peninsula. 10 days later, on August 25th, 1948, under the Soviet Union, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was established under Kim Il-sung. And Kim Il-sung is the grandfather of the current dictator. Now, 1948, when this happened, is also the year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in the United Nations. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written in response to the atrocities that Nazi Germany had committed against the Jewish people and so many others, but also what Imperial Japan did to the Korean people. So 1948 is a significant date because this document was passed by the United Nations, but in North Korea, they never got to understand or even know about these rights. And I want to give you they do have a constitution. North Korea has a constitution, but I've talked to North Koreans from the high up to the low average citizens. None of them knew they even had a constitution, but I want to just read the first line of their constitution. The DPRK is the socialist motherland of juche, where the ideas and leadership of the great comrades Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il are applied. North Korea is an absolute dictatorship. All power is invested in the dictator, Kim Jong-un. The grandson today is the new dictator, and everything is done for his survival. But I wanted to bring up the word, emphasize the word juche, because I wanted to explain that it isn't just a communist dictatorship. It's almost as a theocracy. And I want to talk a little bit about juche because it really helps you understand North Korea if you know about juche. Juche. When Kim Il-sung was a child, he grew up in a Christian home, and I believe he saw the power of the Christian faith living in this home, and during that time period, because under the Japanese colonial period, Imperial Japan was trying to wipe out Korean culture. They literally were trying to tell Koreans they couldn't even have Korean names; they had to adopt Japanese names, and it was the Christians that were fighting the most, pushing back against the Japanese colonizers, because they were fighting against the emperor of Japan and trying to preserve Korean culture. And it's something similar to what we did in our country when we had the Black Robe Regiment, which was the pastors in the churches in colonial America that were speaking out, fighting against the colonizer in that time period, which was, of course, King George. Significantly, in March 1st, 1919, the Koreans adopted a Declaration of Independence from Japan. It was signed by 33 prominent Koreans. 15 of them were Christians. So even though Christians weren't a large majority at all, and they were a small number in Korea, they were hugely involved with pushing back against the Japanese and establishing the Korean Declaration of Independence. So I wanted to point that out because I want to flash forward to Kim Il-sung and what he did when he became dictator. My personal view is that Kim Il-sung saw the power of Christianity, so he set up the juche religion, and it's modeled after the Christian faith. He set himself up as God, his son Kim Il-sung as the Christ figure, and juche is the Holy Spirit. And he took the Apostles' Creed that Christians use, and he turned it into a creed to the Kim dictatorship. He established daily prayers. North Koreans, after they eat a meal, will say, "Thank you, Father Kim Il-sung, from this meal." They have, instead of the 10 commandments, they have the 10 principles for the establishment of the party's single leadership system. Number one principle: we must give our all in the struggle to unify the entire society with Kim Jong-il's Kim Sung-ilism and Kim Jong-ilism. Number two, we must honor the great comrades Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. So you kind of get the drift, but all the principles are towards the worship of the dictator. And instead of having churches and places to study, they have study centers where you have to study the works and teachings of the dictators. Instead of having confession, they have to do self-criticism sessions every week to establish how loyal they've been towards the dictator. And what Kim established, in my opinion, is the only country in the world that does not recognize a single human right under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In other words, North Koreans do not have the right to live where they want to live. They don't have the choice of where they want to go to school. They can't choose the profession they want to pursue. They don't have the right to travel. You can't go from one town to another freely in North Korea. They have no freedom of movement. In other words, they have no freedom of expression. They can't access information outside the government's propaganda. Basically, all aspects of their lives are strictly controlled. Listening to a foreign radio broadcast can result you and your whole family getting sent to a political prison camp. And I wanted to quote one thing from Alexander Solzhenitsyn about religion and about communism. Solzhenitsyn said that within the philosophical system of Marx and Lenin, and at the heart of their psychology, hatred of God is the principal driving force. More fundamental than all their political and economic pretensions, militant atheism is not merely incidental or marginal to communist policy. It is not a side effect, but the central pivot. So to achieve its diabolical ends, according to Solzhenitsyn, communism needs to control a population devoid of religious and national feeling, and this entails the destruction of faith in nationhood. So what Kim Il-sung did was he took these principles of communism, but he established a religion, the worship of himself. Also in North Korea, I mentioned you can be sent to a political prison camp. If there's any whisper of dissent, your entire family can be sent to a political prison camp. So North Korea is a country that has children in political prison camps. Children can be born in political prison camps. Children are suffering in political prison camps in North Korea right now. They also have brainwashing. Like other communist dictatorships in North Korea, the regime works to keep people in the dark, to cut them off from any knowledge of the outside world. They're literally brainwashed from youth. And I want to quote what a defector wrote about how they learn math. This Ko Young-hwan said, "This is a math problem in a North Korean textbook. Our brave soldiers have destroyed with grenades 2 tanks of imperialist Americans. We destroyed another 4 tanks and some of their weapons. How many total of these imperialist tanks have we destroyed?" That's how they learn math. From youth, they learn to hate Americans and to think that we are imperialists. The other thing they have in North Korea that's also unique is they have a classification system called Sungbun. It's a reminder of the caste system in India, where everyone's classified based on their loyalty to the regime. So people that live in Pyongyang, they're the most loyal to the regime. You cannot live in Pyongyang unless you are very, very high up on Sungbun classification. So I task your listeners to look up North Korea at night. Look at a photo of North Korea at night. If you see that, a picture of North Korea at night, you're going to see South Korea with lights, China with lights, and this dark expanse in the middle between South Korea and China. It looks like it must be a body of water, but it's actually where the North Korean people live and suffer. You'll see some bright lights. Those are in Pyongyang. They're likely the bright lights that are lighting up the Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung statues. But that's the system that they have there. There's absolutely no rights. And that's why the people are suffering so much. So with that, I'll close. I do have some things I want to share later about some of the people that we just introduced that escaped from North Korea recently, but I'll bring that up during questioning.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, that was an incredible overview. I learned so much, but I would love to, turn over to Janine. She always has some questions right off the bat. So go ahead. And Janine, you're currently muted.
Here. Okay. I was here saying, wow, wow, wow. That was a lot of very pertinent and important information that and historical. Okay, so for our students, a lot of times we now offer these series in the classrooms for clips for classrooms for teachers. Let's back up a little bit, right? Okay, so explain to the students what Korea was before World War II. And I've got like 6 questions, so they need to be kind of rapid fire answers so that everybody else has time to answer questions. So, you know, what was Korea before World War II?
Well, it was a colony of Japan, and they were being brutally occupied by Japan. Before that, 5,000 years of the Chosun dynasty. It was an incredible nation. They were very isolated, but they did have a treaty with the United States in the 1880s, really when we were a relatively young country. But when Japan colonized Korea, it really tried to wipe out their national identity and their culture. But before that, it was an incredible nation that understood the importance of what our country was going through after its founding. The king of Korea actually reached out and wanted to be introduced to American ideals and invited missionaries to come in to Korea. That's when the Korean started establishing universities for women, because the king of Korea realized the Americans have something really neat. They may be a young country, but there's something about America that's amazing. So this 5,000-year-old nation reached out to these little pipsqueaks Americans, and they established a treaty. I think it was 1886, and that's when we opened up relations with Korea.
Okay, so at that point, before World War II and the Japanese invasion, that king did not consider himself God.
No.
Okay. All right. So,
but he was a king.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And then in World War II, Japan took over for our students, right? This is right. Chronological. All right. And then it was divided, and the northern section became under the control of Russia, and the southern, So, but what you described about Kim Jong-un and his father and grandfather and how they are God. This is very Egyptian. They are God, and everyone must honor them. When did that take place? Because that's not communism. So explain to our listeners how, if Russia, got North Korea, that's Marxism, and it's not the theocracy where the leader is God. So when did that happen?
That happened. Kim Il-sung set himself up. He did a holy trinity, where he set himself up as the god of North Korea.
But how did he do that against communist Russia? Did you say Russia was given North Korea?
Well, Russia the Russians picked Kim Il-sung to be the dictator there, and he became the leader of North Korea, and he established the whole juche system and the whole religious system there. But he had free reign to be able to do that.
And what was Russia's power over North Korea? They were given this land, but
that is one of the things that is extremely disturbing to me as an American. But we looked at it as the Soviet Union was our ally against the Japanese and Germany, the Axis powers at the time, and we allowed them to liberate, so-called liberate, North Korea. I think it was a horrible thing that we did, because they were never free. They were basically gave up. They basically were free to the Japanese colonizers, but then had to be under the communist dictatorship of Kim Il-sung.
So the communists they just didn't really care what the Kim Jong-un dynasty decided to do, if he made himself God or not, as long as they were under the thumb of communist Russia. Was that the thought?
Exactly. And the same thing happens today. Why does communist China do so much to help that North Korea regime? Because they'd rather have a communist dictatorship controlled by the Kim family than to have a free and vibrant liberal democracy as they have in South Korea.
Okay, really interesting. So thank you for explaining that for all the young students to really understand, to back up a little bit. The fact that he's so now that Kim Jong-un, is he no longer Christ, so to speak? Is he God? I mean, because earlier he was Christ. And who's the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, juche. The juche religion is the Holy Spirit. But I have to tell you, Janine, let me give you an example of how this it manifests itself with the people there. There's a young woman that works for Free North Korea Radio, that works for our radio station, who escaped from North Korea. She told me that when Kim Jong-il died, she couldn't believe that. She was like, why am I still here? Our God died. How can I still be here?
Mm.
That's how much the brainwashing, it's so intense. I mean, they believe that their dictator never even has to go to the bathroom, that he's this ultimate God. It's just bizarre.
Wow.
But that's why I wanted to point that out. It's even beyond being a communist system that they've set up. It's a theocracy in a way, because everybody has to worship the dictator.
Now Kim Jong-un is God. He's God now.
Oh yeah, Kim Jong-un is the new God. But that's another reason why they are so anti-Semitic and they hate Christians. And that's why Christianity is considered the greatest threat to the North Korea regime. Because when you acknowledge that you're a human being born with certain rights, it undermines the whole lies of the regime, that gives them no value except the value they have by being loyal to Kim Jong-un.
Okay, I have two more quick questions. Thank you so much. Really terrific. Concentration camps. I have three quick questions. I'll throw to you and let you answer, and then we'll toss to Tova. Concentration camps. We hear that thrown around a lot, right? We're very familiar with what it was like in World War II, right? But now they have them, supposedly they still exist in China and in Russia and obviously North Korea. So explain to our young viewers what a concentration camp is today, and if they really do exist. A. B. Explain who Solzhenitsyn is. I know who he is. He's a Russian that was in a concentration camp and wrote an amazing book about it. And those are my last two questions.
So answer your question about concentration camps. What they have in North Korea is they have concentration camps where you are sent and never return. They're basically death camps where you go and you're worked to death.
And why are you sent there? Why are you sent there?
Because you may have listened to a foreign radio broadcast. You may have gotten hold of a Bible and read a Bible. You may not have properly bowed towards the mandatory photo of Kim Jong-il in your home.
Wow.
You've shown any whisper of discontent, you will be sent there, but you'll also be sent there with your family members. They also have camps, they're re-education camps, where there is a hope of getting out. Kang Chul-hwan wrote The Aquarians of Pyongyang. He was sent to a concentration camp when he was 8 years old because his grandfather voiced concerns about the regime. So they took his whole family, and he spent 10 years, but he was eventually released from the camp. So you have the camps where there's no hope of ever getting out, where people just die. Then you have re-education camps where you go, and then you have detention centers where people are sent as I mentioned, you do not have the freedom to travel. So if a North Korean tries to escape and the Chinese send them back, you will be sent to a detention center. You will be tortured. You could be sent to a political prisoner camp. But in detention centers, they also have those in North Korea. So there's several levels. What it's like, they're basically places where you're worked to death and you're treated like subhuman. And the guards are instructed that you are no longer human and you are treated terribly, torture, horrible conditions. And Pierre Rigolo did a comparison between the Nazi concentration camps and the North Korean political prison camps, and came to the conclusion that they were actually as bad or worse than the Nazis' gulag. And so, and then speaking of gulags, the Gulag Archipelago, Solzhenitsyn was a survivor of the Russians' gulags, but the North Korean gulags have been around even longer. And
yeah, and Solzhenitsyn's book is really something to read, because he describes in detail what it's like to be there, down to, trying to get a little bit of meat off of a tiny fish bone in his soup bowl.
Exactly. And rats were considered luxury in the North Korea camps. If you could get hold of a rat, that was great. I met one woman one time that she survived on grasshoppers because she was on a re-education camp and she was forced to work on a farm. And she was describing she forced herself to eat grasshoppers because she knew they had protein. But Tava was taught, we talked about this earlier about her family, but we have a lot of Jewish people have gotten involved in our North Korea Freedom Coalition. Rabbi Abraham Cooper, the Associate Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center, is our vice chairman, because Jews and Christians are drawn to the North Korea issue because they see the horrors that are happening there. And it's a reminder of the horrors that were experienced by the Jewish people during Nazi Germany.
Well, thank you for that. And I have to tell you, that's why we have found, that's why I founded Constituting America. And that's why Kathy and I work on it so ardently, is because we do have a constitution that protects those rights, the Bill of Rights that we have. And that it's, that's what keeps America exceptional, and that we have been able to prevent this type of dictatorship overall these couple of centuries of America. So thanks for sharing that. It really searingly visual. So I appreciate it. And I'm going to toss to Tova now, because I have to. Otherwise, I'd ask you questions all day. But it's wonderful to hear everybody else's questions. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I know. I wish these were 10 hours long. I don't know if anyone would watch it for that long, but I definitely would. And then I have a lot of questions, but yeah, thank you so much for that description. It was harrowing, but so important. And I was curious, how did you personally get involved in this fight? I mean, you're not North Korean yourself, and so what drew you to this? How did you get involved?
It was a calling. I prayed once that God would break my heart for what was breaking his heart. And I realized that what's happening in North Korea is breaking God's heart. So it was really a calling of, I hosted my foundation Defense Forum Foundation was very much involved in national security policy and the whole idea that peace through strength. And it's a bipartisan foundation. We have Democrats and Republicans are involved in our work, but it's a bipartisan foundation. It was really focused on national security issues. But I realized that every single country in the world that's a threat to America, that's a threat to other democracies, have the same thing in common. They're a threat to their own people. So I thought I shouldn't just focus on our security. I should focus on human rights. So I started hosting people who escaped from then the Soviet Union, people who escaped from communist China, and Cuba. I hosted a Cuban Air Force pilot, Orestes Lorenzo, amazing stories. And it was amazing to hear how these people who lived in these dictatorships, who were brainwashed and isolated, what made them say, I'm turning against the system of government and I'm going to flee and take my chances. What led them to do that? And they were fascinating to hear their stories. And then I started engaging with the South Korean government, saying, I'd like to hear from a North Korean. At the time, there weren't that many North Korean escapees. Now there's over 35,000, but at the time there was a handful, and there was only a couple of survivors of the political prison camp. But I hosted the first North Korean defectors, and they basically said to me, they said, Suzanne, don't move on to the next communist dictatorship. Nobody knows about North Korea. Please keep hosting North Koreans, because people need to know about the political prison camps. People need to know about the trafficking of North Korean women. People need to know about all the suffering that we're going through. So I kept at it and kept at it and kept at it, and still am doing it.
Wow, yeah, that's incredible. And then, you've worked in this space for 27 years. And so, what have you noticed has changed in North Korea, or has not changed over those 27 years? Like you mentioned that there are a lot more defectors that we see now. Why do we see more defectors now versus when you started? And generally, can you just give an overview of, from your perspective, what's changed in this space?
Well, we have reached the point back in 2014, finally, that the international community has acknowledged that crimes against humanity are being committed in North Korea. We were fighting that fight, trying to say there's political prison camps, there's children in these camps, people are getting killed. 2014, the UN Commission of Inquiry on North Korea came to that conclusion, that crimes against humanity were happening every day in North Korea that have no parallel in the world. So what I've been focused on more than anything is trying to end the regime peacefully through the power of information. So what I have seen changed is the success of our information campaign. We do everything we can to get information into North Korea by land, by sea, and by air. And Free North Korea Radio has become the most popular single-hour broadcasting in North Korea. It's a wonderful partnership, totally produced by North Korean defectors who do the programming and freedom-loving Americans that finance 100% of the shortwave transmission. But what I've seen is, because of COVID, we were winning the information campaign, but because of COVID, Kim Jong-un shut the border down and has escalated the crackdown and trying to ice the people. In fact, they just issued new orders in recent months that they're shooting teenagers who listen to South Korean K-pop music. They're shooting young people if they listen to South Korean K-pop music. So South Korean music, films, American movies have been getting into North Korea secretly up until COVID, and the people have become far more informed. And I have to share one story with you about the movie Titanic, for example. The movie Titanic became a sensation in North Korea. I have met so many people that watched it because it was mind altering, because it showed the love of a human being, sacrificial love. And so it was revolutionary, but the North Korean regime couldn't keep it under wraps. But some really brilliant propaganda worker came up with this brilliant story that they started to feed. They had to respond to this movie. They came up with this: the Titanic died on the the Titanic sunk on the same day that Kim Il-sung was born. So they said the movie was actually not a love story. It was depicting the death of capitalism and the rise of the Kim Il-sung, because it happened on the same day. But we knew we were winning this information campaign until COVID came, and then Kim Jong-un has shut the border down. But we just had several people escape. We just hosted several people who escaped just before the border shut down. And I was amazed at the stories they told, but they said that they overcame everything because they wanted to be free. And they're wondering, they're questioning, why is Kim Jong-un afraid of us listening to K-pop music? Why is he afraid of us watching Crash Landing on You, which has also become popular in North Korea? So that's been the thing that's really motivated me now, is that I believe working with the North Korean defectors, getting them to understand that Americans care about them. And in fact, there's a program you all can get involved in. We call it Letters from America, where we simply people write letters of what they want the people in North Korea to hear about what we are really like. So it's changing the hearts and minds of the North Korean people by giving them the truth and doing it by different techniques that we use. Radio broadcasting, we also do balloon launches, rice bottle launches, water balloon launches, just doing everything we can to get information into North Korea.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. So much of what you said like resonates really well. What I'm curious about is, so I took a class last semester at, in college called authoritarianism, and I'm sure you know so much more about that than even what I learned, but we learned about sort of the balance between repression and so to a point, if you increase repression, you can maintain control. But at least in theory, we learned that if you have too much repression, like people will start to sort of rebel or get discontent. But in North Korea, as you've said that, repression is so absolute. So from your perspective, why hasn't there able to, why hasn't there been more like open discontent? Is it just because the brainwashing is successful, or the repression is just so heavy? And what is your take on that?
It's basically all of the above. It's a surveillance state, and they have people that are monitoring you all the time. And they're cutting off your ability to have access to outside information. But despite all that, one of the women that we just hosted, she said, North Koreans, we're human beings. We're just like everybody else. We're curious. We want to know things. So I feel like that no matter what the regime's done, it hasn't been able to destroy that natural curiosity. But as you say, people ask me the same question. They're like, why, if they're living like that, why don't they rise up? Well, how do movements get established where people rise up? When you think about solidarity, for example, or the Czech, the intellectuals with Václav Havel, the people organizing to rise up, or the American colonists, they had the ability for free association, which is one of our rights under the Constitution. North Korea there's no such thing as a sorority. There's no such thing as a labor union. There's no such thing as any kind of club or anything where you could get together and organize against the regime. In a way, it was brilliant that they set up a system like that. So there's an inability for people to kind of get together and talk about, let's do this, because they're all busy reporting on each other or showing their loyalty to the regime. But I think that things are going to change because of the power of information. And we do know there was organized opposition against the regime one time. It was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there was a group of military leaders who had studied abroad. They'd studied in Moscow. They came back to North Korea and they wanted to bring to North Korea. They believed that in glasnost, they wanted North Korea to open up. And they operated for about 6 or 7 years before they were all found out and either killed or sent to public prison camp. But I bring that up because they had an association. They had gone to school together in Moscow and they had established that outside the country. But that's one of the hardest things. But I absolutely believe that there's people in the regime that want to change the regime. And they just don't know how to go about that. And that's why we need to communicate this information. We need to talk about human rights. We need to talk about the fact that they have these rights. They have rights. Hwang Jong-yap, who helped create the Juche religion, who helped establish the regime, became a very close colleague of mine. He's passed away, but he said, Suzanne, the Achilles heel of the North Korea regime is human rights. When they know that they have value as human beings, when they know about these things, when they know that South Koreans have a constitution that gives them rights, everything will change. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to share and communicate with them that they have human rights, that we care about them, that we want to see them live free. All we want. We're not their enemy. We're not as they're raised. If they're, and I should add, if you go into a kindergarten classroom in North Korea, you're going to see an American soldier knifing a pregnant North Korean women. I mean, that's how much they try to get them to hate us. And that's really, I'm really sensitive about that because I have a son who serves in the army. But when they hear our letters from America and Americans saying, we really care about you, it changes their hearts and their minds. So I think that that's what we have to keep. That's what we have to do in order to talk about human rights, get the truth to the people in North Korea. And again, I work with the North Korean defectors. That's what they're all about, is communicating the truth back to their homeland.
Yeah, I love that. It's like, it's almost like what you said about, I loved what you said, like, God break my heart for what breaks your heart. It's almost like us saying to the North Korean people, like, your heart should break for, what breaks our hearts about your situation. So yeah, I really love that. And then, North Korea, can you talk a bit about the role of the military? Because obviously North Korea, it's a very militarized state. Just, Googling it superficially, I see it's called like the Sun gun system or something, where the military is a very big part of society. So could you talk about this? And then also, how much control does the leadership have over the military, and how do they sort of stop the military from posing a threat, like with what you were talking about earlier with the military leaders who, for instance, had been, educated abroad?
Well, the interesting is that every male has to serve 10 years in the military, and they actually are increasing that age to 13. That they have to serve for 13 years. And women are also required to serve in the military. The only people who are exempt are people really high up on the Sungmun classification system. But the military first is the reason why you saw all the starvation that happened in North Korea. And this is another thing we're trying to communicate to people in North Korea. People starve to death in North Korea. Millions of people starved to death in North Korea during what I call it the Arduous March. And they were told the reason why they're starving is because of the Yankee imperialist wolves, that we caused their starvation. And that is the biggest, just one of many lies, because the international community gave so much food, including the Americans, the World Food Program, the European Union. There was so much humanitarian aid and food aid that went to North Korea. Not a single person needed to starve. But where did that food go? Well, when a UN World Food Program truck would roll into a village, it would hand out the rice to the families, and then it would go on its merry way. And then an unmarked army truck would roll into that village and take all the rice back, because all of the food was going to the military. It was a military first policy. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's another control thing. But when I hosted those first North Korean defectors, one was an army colonel, Cheju Ha. One was a diplomat, Ko Young Hwan. This was in 1997. They stood in front of this Capitol Hill audience and they said, look at us. We're living proof before your eyes of what's happening to your humanitarian aid. Because the army colonel looked like he never missed a meal. And the diplomat looked a bit scrawny, Ko Young Hwan. He looked a bit scrawny, and they said it's going to the military first, and then it's going to the other elites like diplomats, but the people that are starving to death aren't seeing any of it. In fact, I've never met a North Korean who escaped from that regime that saw any of our humanitarian aid. So that's another example of they actually used our aid as a weapon against their own people. And that's how they are able to maintain control. And if you're, if you're serving in the military, you had more access to food than you did if you're starving in some village. But that has always played a major role. But we're wondering, in response to your question, we're wondering, we just dropped 100. Well, we did a balloon launch a couple weeks ago, and the North Korean defectors wrote this message in response, because there's a lot of people pushing back, going, why do we have to serve 13 years? Why do we have to give all the best years of our lives into the military? And this leaflet basically said, you should not have to live like that. You need to rise up and get rid of your dictator. But there is a lot of, I think there's a lot of turmoil in North Korea right now. And that's why we're doing everything we can to get information there, because I think that this regime could end peacefully, much like what happened in Romania. I think if you had to pick a country that North Korea is most like, it's not like any country in the world, but I think what happened in Romania was probably the most like that, because the Romanian dictator Ceausescu actually set up a lot of what he did in Romania based on thinking Kim Il-sung, man, he's really got a great dictatorship. I'm going to do some of the stuff he's doing. And so there's some similarities there, but yeah, anyway, I hope that answered your question. Sorry.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. Again, could talk forever, but I'll pass on for the last 15 minutes. Thank you.
Well, thank you for everything you've explained so far. So bunch of questions, try to ask quick. Number one, how have they been able to sustain their economic system? Who trades with them, or how can this oppressive government not crumble from just not having enough to support itself?
Well, the reason why great question. The reason why the famine happened was because when the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost a big partner in helping support them. But the country that's done the most to help them survive is China. And even though the international community has tried to enact sanctions targeted at the elites in that regime, those sanctions have been undermined constantly by China, which has provided them a lot of aid and has continued to purchase things from China. That has brought in coal cash.
Does that go back to when to the beginning of the North Korean regime, of the current North Korean regime, or is that more of an after China became more industrialized?
After China became more of a industrial, because their biggest contributor before that was the Soviet Union. But they're first of all, they do a lot of illegal activities. They send their workers abroad as slave laborers. That's cold cash for the regime. The United Nations has been trying to end that practice of having these slave laborers. Russia, they had lumber workers working in Russia. They have restaurant workers in China, where these people go abroad and they work, but in almost their entire wages go back to the regime. They have all these money-making regimes for the Kim dictatorship. And they also do this, they've been stealing billions of dollars on cryptocurrency, but they've got all kinds of ways. Now, back on the North Korea, something important to recognize is that when the Korean War happened, there's so much that I could share, but we didn't even talk about the Korean War. But when the Korean War happened, 1950, 1953, at that time, when the North and South Korea was the agrarian country, and North Korea was actually industrialized, much more industrialized. And when you see what happened after the war, South Korea became, they call it the miracle on the Han River. When you look at what happened with South Korea, the industry that's been created, South Korea is a lead. That's another thing we try to tell the North Korean people. South Korea is 11th largest economy in the world, and they did that in a very short time. When you think about it, I find that the Korean people themselves are incredibly industrious, and some of the people that we just hosted, they were women in North Korea who helped create the free market system. They actually, during the famine, they actually created a market system. The women did it because the men weren't getting paid because they had run out of money for the regime. So women went to work and became capitalist and created a market system, which they've tried to control it. But that's why people were able to survive, was because women became entrepreneurs, and they created a market system, a capitalist system in there. But again, back to the beginning, the biggest benefactor they have is China. China's undermined the sanctions and taken pressure off that regime. They do all kinds of illegal activities. They've been involved in counterfeiting. They're involved in drugs. They're involved in cryptocurrency. They're involved in cyber attacks. So and they put their own people out as slave laborers. But I would say China is probably their biggest benefactor.
Yeah, wow. It makes our thinking about that definitely needs to be a factor in people's head as we think about international politics with countries of who is basically allowing this to take place. Because if they were isolated, it probably wouldn't be able to continue without having a country like China to do that. Could you say anything about, I recently heard, my mind was just blown the first time I heard a North Korean defector talk about some of the things that are almost unique to the North Korean version of a communist state. What you said about that religion being set up around the communist dictator is one of those things that has made it almost a more effective at being just destructive and horrible and powerful. Another thing I thought that I've heard is about their control of language. Do you have I heard about talked about words that they don't even have in North Korea, and maybe as your last thing that could help us and the viewers before we get to the viewer questions, say just about their control of language.
Yeah, that is an excellent question, because this just happened recently. They just had issued another anti-revolutionary thought where they're banning any terms that are related to South Korea at all. They're actually banning their people from using any South Korea terms. You can get sent to a political prison camp for that. So yeah, they're controlling the language. I'm just wondering, who's just curious, the defector, do you remember the defector you heard?
Yeah, the first defector I heard talk about it was Yeonmi Park.
Oh, Yeonmi, yeah. She wrote the book In Order to Live. Exactly. Yeah, she just wrote another book. While there's still time, or before it's too late, or whatever. She just wrote a new book about her experience at Columbia University. So yeah, she's been very articulate speaking out about this and the suffering that happens there. But yeah, controlling words, controlling language. That's another indication of how much influence has happened from them learning from the outside world, that they have
she had explained how going back to why don't the people rise up, if you don't have even some of these concepts, you don't have them inherently. If you talk about a right, if that concept does not exist, and I think that's really hard for us to even try to comprehend. Like, imagine if there was no word for love, no word for freedom, no word for these things. How would you even conceptualize it to do it? And understanding that they don't have any context for where they are in the world, or understand where other countries are, or what other countries are, or anything like that. I mean, I don't think any of us can quite imagine what that's like. I think it's really good that we had this show today for you to kind of explain it, because it's probably one of the, I don't know if there's any country on Earth right now that is quite like North Korea.
You're right, there isn't. And the idea of human right, they don't know what a human right is. If you asked a woman, what's the value of a woman? She would say it's the equivalent value of a fly. That's how they see themselves in that dictatorship, that they have the same value as a fly. And you think about what's happening in Iran, who's leading that? It's women. It's women say, I've had enough. So.
All right, Tova, we get to some of these audience questions. So thank you so much, Suzanne, and for all the work you do.
Yeah, thank you so much. Those were great questions. And then before we go on to audience questions, I want to shout out some students who are on today. We always love when we get young people. And so I just want to give some people some shout outs. So for instance, we have from Becca Turner, the Covenant Christian Academy is watching. So quite a lot of students from there. So welcome. Thanks for being here. We have Sherry Stegall, 3 homeschool students on. From Hamilton County Virtual School, 30 students, really, really exciting. Victoria Kirk, another homeschool with 2 students, and Hope Mucklow, another student. And if I didn't shout you out, we're sorry for missing you, and we're so glad to have you on. Thanks so much for being on. And then just to read a few audience questions out. We had a question from Philip Kamen, which I was kind of wondering too. Have you been to North Korea, or is that sort of out of the question the second you got involved in your advocacy?
No, I would end up like Otto Warmbier. No, seriously, because they threatened my life. And I've never been to North Korea, but I've been to South Korea a lot. So yeah, I haven't been to North Korea, but when it's free, I'll go.
Do you get a lot of like threats to your life from the regime?
Yes. There was one, I have to tell you the story because it's kind of a miraculous thing, but I got this picture in that went to the North Korea Freedom Coalition, and it said, "To Suzanne Scholte, you will die." And it was this picture, this horrific picture of a woman. I didn't know what it was, but the guy who does our website, wonderful guy, Jason West, he said, "Suzanne, that's the Black Dahlia, which is this unsolved murder case in LA." And it said, "We see you everywhere. You will die. You will die. This is your fate, Suzanne Scholte," or whatever. And when I saw that, I was really ashamed. And I was rattled. It really shook me up. And I didn't want anybody to know about it. And what struck me was there was somebody in North Korea who did this research to find this horrific photo to send to me with a death threat, that somebody hated me that much. So it really rattled me. But within a few days after that happened, I went to my went to our PO box, and I opened it up, and there were all these postcards from people in South Korea that said, "We love you. Thank you for taking care of North Korea. Thank you for fighting for freedom. You're wonderful." And it was like totally, I don't know if it was a Sunday school class or a homeschool class, but that was a God thing, because God knew they were going to come at me hard. And so he stirred up somebody in South Korea. I never knew who it was, because all the home address was a letter from heaven. Gwanji Province, South Korea. Never knew who it came from. Anyway, but yeah.
Wow, chills. And it's amazing you continue your work despite all of that. So thank you so much. And then also we got a question from Deborah DiMeao, asking about whether the regime, do they control like birth or reproduction? And if so, in what sense?
Great question, because they had the one-child policy in China, but no, in North Korea, they don't have a one-child policy like they have in China. But so you have to get permission for who you're going to marry. But my understanding is they would welcome people having children. They wouldn't be opposed to that.
Who do you have to get permission from to get married?
The local officials.
Wow. Just like a total other level of
It'll depend
control.
on where you are on Sungbang. You're going to have certain controls over, and like where you want to go to school. Or I knew one woman who defected with her whole family because she was a gymnast and she wanted to be a gym coach, and they wouldn't let her. They were going to put her to work in a factory because her sungbung wasn't high enough, and she's like, I want to be a gym coach. So they got out of there. This was like 15 years ago, but yeah, the fact that they control what you can do with your profession, where you can go to school, is another way that they interfere with your ability to have any kind of human right, any kind of development yourself.
Oh, and then sort of shifting topics, and feel free to like not answer if this isn't really your area of expertise, but from what you've been talking about, it's made me think a lot about the sort of plight of Uyghurs in China, and how a lot of people of that minority are being sent to concentration camps, re-education camps, etc. So has there been any parallel to your work as this has become an issue that's been increasingly prominent? And does that affect the relationship between China and North Korea, that they both sort of engage in like parallel repressions with like similar methods? Or what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that I am a huge fan of the people who've been fighting for the Uyghurs, and we kind of bonded some of the people that have spoken out for the Uyghurs. And there's just a funny story. When one of the dictators from China was coming to the White House, a bunch of us showed up at Lafayette Square to protest against China, and it was Tibetans, Uyghurs, Christians. It was North Korea human rights advocates. It was like we kind of all bond because we run into each other in different ways. But this might not be related to the question, but with regard to Uyghurs. But the problem that we have is this: we should require to be a member of the United Nations that you adhere to at least half the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you're going to be a member of the Human Rights Council, you at least ought to have 80% adhere to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, the UN has become such a corrupt institution, and what's happening to the Uyghurs is just horrible. And it took decades for it to be named a genocide. It's a genocide that they're doing into the Uyghurs, and but it took them so long for anybody to pay attention, just like the political prison camps in North Korea. And the sad thing is, the whole purpose of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was to say, never again, never again, never again will we have a Holocaust. Never again will we let those kinds of things happening. But it's happening. It's happening to the Uyghurs. It's happening to North Koreans. Happening to Tibetans. It's happening, all over the world, these horrors.
Yeah, well, we are at the end of our hour, and I just want to thank you so much for your time and for all the work you do. I know I really learned a lot, and I'm sure all of our viewers did too. Thank you for being on, and if anybody else wants to say goodbye, feel free to go ahead, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your work, and hopefully us and others will support it and write letters and prayers and everything else.
Yeah, letters from America.
Yes,
everybody can join.
Thank you, Suzanne. You're such a light, and your energy is very contagious and inspirational. Thank you very much for all that you do.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for what you do.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day.